A parasol vanished, yet left behind whispers of betrayal. Welcome to Verities Obscures. I am your host, Alexander. This mystery-loving community is growing fast. Tell me where you're watching from. Your comments truly brighten this journey. Let's begin. The sun shone with quiet insistence on Chipping Woodley, a village so picturesque it looked like something out of an Edwardian postcard. The hedges were trimmed, the rose bushes were in bloom, and the vicar's wife had just taken a fresh batch of lemon sponge out of the oven. It was the kind of summer day that called for parasols, cups of tea, and idle chatter on striped deck chairs beneath ancient oak trees, and that was precisely what the villagers were doing on the rolling lawn of the Mortimer estate, where Lady Eugenia Mortimer, widow of a former Minister of Parliament and the grand doyenne of village society, was holding her annual charity garden party in aid of the county hospital. Clotted cream and gossip flowed freely. Miss Marple sat at the edge of the gathering, demure in a pale lilac dress and a neat little straw hat trimmed with violets. She sipped her tea and observed, not the fashion or the festivities, but the little things, a flick of the hand, a nervous glance exchanged between acquaintances, the slightly too long laugh. No one noticed her observation, and she preferred it that way. "Oh, come and see the raffle prizes, Miss Marple," called Joyce Lembridge, the minister's daughter, a brilliant young woman with far too romantic ideas. "There's a most charming lace parasol, quite antique. It was Mrs. Hargrave who gave it. Mrs. Hargrave." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled behind her glasses. How generous. She's usually so attached to her collection. "Yes," Joyce replied in a low, conspiratorial voice. "That's just it. She claims it disappeared last week, and now it's been found under the raffle tent. She says someone must have stolen it." Miss Marple blinked slowly. How curious. They had just reached the tent, filled with jars of preserves, hand-knitted wools, and carefully labeled donations, when a shrill scream pierced the gentle afternoon warmth. Heads turned. A maid ran up, her face pale and her apron askew. "It's Lady Mortimer." In the parlor, the poor girl couldn't say it, but she didn't need to. A quiver of unease ran through the garden like a sudden gust of wind. Miss Marple was already busy, silently, efficiently, unnoticed by most, as the crowd rushed toward the Mortimer residence. Her teacup lay abandoned on a wrought-iron table, its saucer perfectly still. In the parlor, Lady Mortimer was slumped on the sofa, her gloved hand clutching her brooch as if to protect it. A fine china teacup sat on a side table beside her, untouched except for a faint smear of lipstick. The room smelled of roses, shoe polish, and something else, something metallic. The doctor, summoned 2 doors down, arrived a few minutes later. He leaned toward her, his lips pursed, then shook his head gravely. "She's gone," he murmured. "A heart attack, perhaps, though rather sudden." Miss Marple stood in a corner, nodding slightly. She watched the way Joyce covered her mouth in horror, the way Colonel Draycott made no eye contact, and the faint, strange expression of relief on Mrs. Hargrave's face. Outside, a lace parasol fluttered on the ground in the breeze, unnoticed by anyone. But not by Miss Marple. By the next morning, the quiet of Chipping Woodley had become eerie. It was the kind of silence that followed, not peace, but a collective breath, a village suspended, waiting for something to happen. Lady Eugenia Mortimer's death, though seemingly tragic and sudden, had stirred something deeper than mere grief, something less polite. At the post office, where the morning queue formed with almost ritualistic precision, Mrs. Edgecombe, the grocer, leaned across the counter to whisper a confidential word to Mrs. Blackwell, who sold haberdashery and scandals with equal enthusiasm. Dropped dead in her own living room, it seemed, and in the middle of the garden party, no less. "What do you think?" Mrs. Blackwell lowered her voice, though the whole shop leaned in to hear her. "Heart," the doctor said, but she wasn't one to faint. She walked a mile every day to tend her roses. She never missed a meeting at the Women's Guild. Miss Edgecombe nodded meaningfully. "And did you hear about the parasol? Vanishing, then reappearing under the raffle marquee?" "Yes. And wasn't it Mrs. Hargrave's? She claims it's hers, but who would really know with all that frilly lace? It looks like something out of a traveling theatre." Outside, on the corner of the main road that wound past the vicarage, Mr. Sims, the milkman, had stopped his deliveries to chat with old Tom Belling, the manor gardener. They were standing beside a wheelbarrow of begonias, and a can of still warm milk. The police say nothing suspicious, said Sims, shifting the crate onto his shoulder. Natural causes. Still, it's funny. It happened just as the raffle was about to start. Tom rubbed his chin. I heard she was arguing with someone earlier. In the morning, before the guests arrived. Harsh words, they said, from above. Sims raised an eyebrow. Who will? Tom looked down at the begonias, as if they might offer protection. It could have been anyone. The family was always a bit divided, wasn't it? Speaking of family, Sims replied. When did her nephew reappear? Henry Mortimer. He thought he'd gone abroad. Oh, he reappeared a month ago. He was staying in the East Wing. Keep a low profile. He came back after that business in London. Something about a failed company. Rather low profile though. Too low profile, in my opinion. Further down the alley, a more reserved conversation was taking place in the uncluttered space of the vicarage drawing room. Miss Marple sat opposite Reverend Lumbridge and his daughter Joyce, sipping slightly cooled tea, her eyes fixed on the lace doily rather than on her host. It upset everyone, the Reverend said gravely. Lady Mortimer wasn't always loved, but she was a pillar of Chipping Woodley. Garden parties were a fixture of village life. Miss Marple inclined her head, and she does a lot for the hospital fund. Joyce spoke, her voice tinged with youthful indignation. She didn't deserve to die like this. She had collapsed, like something out of a play, and everyone's watching. I can't stop thinking about the raffle. She was supposed to announce the first prize just before the shout. Indeed, Miss Marple murmured, and how strange that such an unfortunate incident should occur at precisely this moment. Public, yet untouchable. Joyce frowned. What do you mean? Well, my dear, it was the kind of scene where all eyes are on the show, and very few notice what's going on in the corners. Her gaze flicked to the clock on the mantelpiece, then back to the girl. Tell me, who helped in the drawing room yesterday? Joyce looked surprised. Only the maid, Clara. And I think Mrs. Hargrave had gone to check the price table. She's very particular about her things. Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully, then turned to the Reverend. Were the police satisfied, do you think? The vicar hesitated. Dr. Forbes certifies natural causes, but I imagine the chief inspector is reluctant to investigate further. There's a general distaste, you see, for disturbing the dead unnecessarily, especially someone of Lady Mortimer's standing. Miss Marple gave a faint smile. Yes, that's often the case. Yet, as I have found, death rarely cares about social rank when it strikes. Later that day, an impromptu gathering had formed in the drawing room of the Red Stag Inn, where the landlord, Mr. Prowse, had served a tray of tea that no one had touched. Among them were Mrs. Hargrave herself, tall, imperious, and exuding a kind of contemptuous sang-froid, as well as Colonel Draycott, retired from the army, but still imbued with command, and Miss Elspeth Norton, a little-known but opinionated novelist. I don't mean to slander, Miss Norton was saying in a dry, theatrical voice, but sudden deaths rarely occur in the middle of a cup of tea, unless there is a compelling motive or a weak heart. Nonsense, said Colonel Draycott, stirring his tea with unnecessary force. The woman was 70. Heart attacks need no motive, Mrs. Hargrave broke in coldly. She was 71, Colonel, and she had the constitution of a horse. A horse that relished its sherry, Miss Norton muttered, earning a glare. I suppose, Hargrave continued, ignoring the interruption. I should be grateful that someone found my parasol, even under absurd circumstances, but how it ended up among the raffle items is beyond me. Was it really yours? Draycott asked provocatively. Mrs. Hargrave stiffened. It was part of my late aunt's estate. Belgian lace, ivory handle, quite unique. Miss Norton leaned forward, with the satisfaction of someone dropping a stone into a quiet pond. And of great value, I take it. Mrs. Hargrave's lips tightened, but she gave a simple, measured nod. On the other side of the village, and in the very heart of it all, Miss Marple returned to her quiet cottage, on Old Mill Lane. She paused in the garden to cut some faded flowers from the geraniums, and nodded amiably to the passing grocer's boy. Inside she took off her gloves, put the kettle on to boil, and took a small notebook from a drawer. Sitting at her table, she drew up a neat column of names. Lady Mortimer, deceased. Mrs. Hargrave, lace parasol, pattern,
Henry Mortimer nephew. Recently returned Joyce Lumbridge present at the raffle tent. Colonel Draycott, irascible, evasive. Miss Norton too interested, by half. Beneath the list, she added a question in her neat, looping handwriting. Why had the parasol disappeared, and who had something to gain by its return? The kettle whistled. Miss Marple poured herself a cup of tea and looked out of the window at the village beyond. People were talking, as always, but the words were only the surface. Beneath them, as she well knew, lay something much darker, and someone somewhere in Chipping Woodley was hiding the truth. By the second day, the polite whispers from Chipping Woodley had given way to an undercurrent of suspicion. Although the doctor had mentioned a heart attack, and the inspector had quickly agreed, few in the village were entirely satisfied. There was an eerie quality to the whole affair that hung in the air like smoke from a put-out fire, not dangerous enough to alarm, but too persistent to be ignored. Miss Marple, as usual, did not get directly involved. She knew full well that people said more when they thought no one was really listening. So she walked, slowly and unhurriedly, along the foxglove and honeysuckle-lined lanes, past stone houses with low thatched roofs, and into the heart of the village. At the grocer's in the main street, she found Miss Edgecombe, again deep in discussion, this time with Miss Elspeth Norton, who was choosing pears with the attention of a lawyer examining evidence. I still maintain, Miss Norton was saying, that someone stood to gain from Lady Mortimer's death. Her will must have been worth a small fortune. Miss Edgecombe clicked her tongue. Money makes enemies, they say, but she had already made arrangements, hadn't she? The estate goes to her nephew, hasn't it? Henry, indeed, Miss Norton replied. He's back just in time too, hasn't he? He only just got back a month ago, after a rather unfortunate affair in London. Speculations and failed investments, if I remember correctly. Miss Marple selected a small tin of biscuits and walked discreetly to the counter. Miss Norton, never one to ignore an audience, turned her attention to her. You knew Lady Mortimer well, didn't you, Miss Marple? Oh, not as intimately as you might think, she replied with a modest smile. We crossed paths at the Women's Guild and the hospital committee, of course. But I've always thought that it's not what you see of a person that reveals their character, but how they talk about others. Miss Norton raised an eyebrow. And what did she say about others? She told me once, Miss Marple said quietly, that a person's politeness often conceals resentment, but seldom very well. There was a brief silence. Miss Norton returned to her duties. Meanwhile, on the other side of the village, Sergeant Davis, a kindly but unimaginative man, was making his round. Although the case was officially closed, the doctor's report was firm, and the chief inspector had no desire to stir up high society. Some questions persisted, and Davis, though unintuitive, had learned to pay attention to the unanimous murmurs of the village. He started at the Mortimer estate, where the housekeeper, Mrs. Langley, greeted him in the entrance hall with reddened eyes and a stiff manner. I have served Lady Mortimer for over 20 years, she said with quiet pride. This house would not be the same without her. Did you notice anything strange that day? Davis asked. Before the party began, Mrs. Langley hesitated, her fingers twisting the edge of her apron. She was disturbed. She snapped at Clara, the maid, for not polishing the silver tray properly, and she had a letter that annoyed her. She read it at breakfast, then put it away in her writing table. What sort of letter? I couldn't say, but she paced the drawing room afterward, muttering to herself. I think it was about Mr. Henry. Sergeant Davis had noted that in his notebook. And was Mr. Henry all right that morning? He was. Out for a walk after breakfast. Back just after noon. Said he'd been in the woods. Davis nodded. And the parasol doesn't know how it ended up in the raffle tent. Mrs. Langley snorted. That thing, I saw it on the hall table the day before the party. It was odd, but Lady Mortimer didn't usually mix with raffles. She was too proud for that. Didn't she ever say who put it there? She didn't, and I didn't ask. I didn't notice it was missing until the next morning. The sergeant thanked her and walked back down the gravel path. He didn't have the imagination to spot scams around every corner, but even he sensed something was amiss. A worried wife, a mysterious letter, a misplaced valuable, and a death that was a touch too convenient. Meanwhile, Miss Marple had stopped for tea with Miss Weatherby, a retired school teacher, with thin glasses and a memory like a book. I remember this parasol, Mrs. Weatherby was saying, pouring the tea with academic precision. Mrs. Hargrave had carried it in the Jubilee parade. Oh, at least 10 years ago. She'd told anyone who would listen that it was antique Belgian lace, rather boastfully, in fact, and she claimed it had been stolen just before the garden party. Asked Miss Marple. She'd made a big deal about it 2 days ago. Mrs. Weatherby confirmed. She'd told half the Women's Guild that she'd disappeared from her drawing room. She'd said she was certain someone had been in her house. Accused someone, not directly, but she'd hinted it might have been one of the young ladies from the vicarage, or perhaps Miss Elspeth Norton. You know Elspeth had been invited to the Hargraves' house and left in a huff. I forget why. Miss Marple sipped her tea. One rarely forgets slights, even small ones. She left soon after, walking slowly back to her cottage. On the way she stopped at the churchyard, where Joyce Lembridge was arranging wildflowers in jam jars along the low stone wall.
Joyce, my dear, Miss Marple said softly. You mentioned that you were in the raffle tent when Lady Mortimer collapsed. Did you notice anyone coming in or going out just before? Joyce straightened up. I was preparing the prize table, checking that the numbers were correct. Clara came in briefly and said she was looking for someone, and I saw Henry Mortimer outside by the hedge. He looked like he was going to come in, but then changed his mind. Did he see you? I think so. He turned and walked away quickly when he noticed me. And Mrs. Hargrave, she was near the entrance, talking to Colonel Draycott. He was very animated, waving his hands. She seemed annoyed. Miss Marple nodded, looking serene. How interesting. In the evening, the village was plunged into an awkward silence. The curtains had been drawn earlier. The whispers persisted, and the scent of rosewater and uncertainty hung on the breeze. At her desk, Miss Marple reopened her notebook. She added 3 new lines under her growing list of observations. Lady Mortimer received a disturbing letter that Henry had seen near the raffle marquee, then fled. Parasol disappeared from Hargrave House, and mysteriously reappeared. She paused, gently tapping her pencil. Something seemed out of place. Not the parasol itself, but its return. It hadn't simply been stolen. It had been taken, then planted and forced into public view. A message, perhaps. Miss Marple sat back in her chair. The human mind, she reflected, has a habit of revealing itself in the smallest acts, not just because it takes, but by what it wants others to see. Tomorrow she will visit Mrs. Hargrave, and she would ask, very quietly, what could have disappeared from Chipping Woodley? By the morning after Lady Eugenia Mortimer's death, the village of Chipping Woodley had carefully organized itself. In a place so steeped in civility, lines were never openly drawn, but in subtle glances the arrangement of cups, whispered conversations on the doorstop, and long pauses by the flower beds, alliances were formed. Miss Marple, whose morning began as always with tea and toast in her rose-bedecked kitchen, had received a note slipped through the letterbox. The handwriting was neat, but quick. Miss Marple, may I call on you this morning? I seem to remember something important about the garden party. Yours sincerely, Joyce Lembridge. Miss Marple smiled gently. It often happened that young people didn't remember things until the noise of gossip had died down. Joyce, though idealistic and fanciful, was also observant in her own way. At 10:30, Joyce arrived, her cheeks flushed, her eyes shining with a mixture of worry and excitement. I hope I'm not indiscreet, she said as Miss Marple showed her in. Not at all, my dear, Miss Marple replied, pouring a second cup. I always believe that deep memories are worth listening to. Joyce sat on the edge of her chair, twirling her gloves in her lap. It's Clara, the maid. Come on. She was terribly disturbed that day. Not just from stress. I thought at first it was the crowd, but now I wonder if something else had happened. She comes into the drawing room, just before Lady Mortimer collapses. Just for a minute, then she rushes out. Her hands were shaking. And what did she say? Nothing, said Joyce. That's all. She acted as if she wasn't supposed to be there. Miss Marple nodded slowly. Has anyone else seen her? I think it was Mrs. Hargrave. She was coming from the corridor, and I noticed she stopped, looked at Clara, and said something, but Clara didn't answer. She just ran into the kitchen. "That's very revealing," Miss Marple murmured. Joyce hesitated. "Do you think Clara might have done something?" Miss Marple smiled slightly. "My dear, I find people often do something when they're afraid. Not necessarily something nasty, but it's wise to understand what caused that fear." After Joyce left, Miss Marple retrieved her cardigan and walked through the village, stopping now and then to exchange pleasantries, to listen without question, to absorb without intruding. At the back entrance to the Mortimer estate, she found Clara sweeping the stone steps, her slim figure bent and cautious. When Miss Marple greeted her, the girl almost jumped. "Oh, Miss Marple, I didn't see you. Forgive me, Clara. I was admiring the ivy. It grows so beautifully on the back trellis." Clara glanced nervously toward the house. "Yes, miss." Miss Marple leaned slightly on her cane. "You must be very tired. These last few days have been trying." Clara's eyes suddenly filled with tears. "I didn't mean any harm," she blurted out. "I just came in to bring the tray. She asked me for it." Miss Marple's expression remained unchanged. "Lady Mortimer?" "Yes, miss. That morning she told me to bring her the silver tea tray from the pantry. She wanted it placed in the parlor before the guests arrived. But when I brought it, she looked strange. She said she didn't remember asking for it, and looked really scared." Miss Marple nodded sympathetically. "So you left it and went out?" "Yes. And later, just before the raffle, I went back to get the empty cup she'd left. But she hadn't touched it. And was there no one else in the room at the time?" Clara looked away. "I don't think so. But Mrs. Hargrave was just outside the door. She looked in, saw me, and why, she gave me such a strange look, miss. As if I'd broken something precious." "Thank you, Clara," Miss Marple said softly. "You've been a great help." Leaving the girl to sweep, Miss Marple walked slowly along the path behind the house, where the trees were thicker and the scent of pines mingled with the lingering scent of roses. She was to examine carefully everything Lady Mortimer had locked away, her fear on the morning of the party, Clara's trembling hands, and Mrs. Hargrave's piercing gaze. Back in the village, Sergeant Davis received new instruction. Although the official decision remained a natural cause, the magistrate, no doubt prompted by the whispers that were intensifying by the hour, had asked the constable to discreetly check the circumstances once more. "I'd like to speak to Henry Mortimer," Davis told the housekeeper as they returned to the estate. Mrs. Langley pursed her lips. "He's in the library. Yet he's not very talkative." Henry Mortimer was standing by the fireplace when Davis entered. Tall, angular, with a thinness that suggested sleepless nights. There were dark circles under his eyes, but not, Davis thought, from grief. "I understand this is difficult," Davis began, notebook in hand, "but I would appreciate your help." Henry nodded curtly. "Of course. You were away when your aunt died in the garden, weren't you?" "In the East Orchard," Henry replied. "It's quiet there. I needed a moment before the party." "Did you speak to her that morning?" Henry's jaw clenched. "Briefly. She was agitated and told me she'd received a letter about me. She accused him of hiding something. I didn't understand what she meant." "And you? Were you hiding something?" Henry was silent for a long time. "I was in debt. I told her when I got back. She agreed to help me, but the letter upset her." "Do you know who sent it?" "No," Henry said quietly, "but I have a hunch." Sergeant Davis raised an eyebrow. "And who could it be?" Henry glanced out the window. "Mrs. Hargrave. She always hated me, said I wasn't worthy of the estate. I wouldn't be surprised if she stirred up trouble." After leaving the library, Davis returned to the village with more questions than answers. He passed Miss Marple outside the post office and gave her a polite nod. "I think we're beginning to go around the obvious," he said. Miss Marple smiled. "The obvious, Sergeant, is often a resting place when one is tired of thinking, but it seldom leads to the truth." He tipped his cap with a half smile.
and went on his way. Later that afternoon, Miss Marple called Mrs. Hargrave, who received her with warm hospitality. "Miss Marple," she said, ushering her into a drawing room that smelled faintly of lavender and starch. "I thought you'd come." "Curiosity," Miss Marple replied pleasantly. "It's one of my weaknesses." Mrs. Hargrave poured the tea with mechanical precision. "We all want answers, but that was her heart." "That's what the doctor said." "Of course," Miss Marple said, stirring her tea. "But one wonders what can upset a heart so suddenly, especially one that has endured many shifts before." Mrs. Hargrave stiffened. "Are you implying?" "Not at all, but you must admit the circumstances were unusual. The parasol, for example." Mrs. Hargrave's expression hardened. "This parasol was stolen from my house, and I believe it was returned to humiliate me." "Stolen or borrowed?" Miss Marple asked gently, then introduced at the perfect moment, just as Lady Mortimer was collapsing. Miss Hargrave's eyes narrowed. "Are you implying that I arranged such a thing?" "Not at all," Miss Marple said, putting down her cup. "But I wonder who else would have known it was yours." Mrs. Hargrave hesitated. "Someone at the guild. It's no secret. And Miss Norton, she's known to take a keen interest in other people's affairs." The woman thinks everything is a story to be written. She'd probably kill someone herself if it could be a bestseller." Miss Marple smiled weakly. "People do strange things to attract attention, but they do stranger things to mask fear." As the shadows lengthened along the garden paths, and the rooftops of Chipping Woodley gilded in the setting sun, Miss Marple went home. She had asked all the right questions. Now she just had to wait for the wrong answer. They always revealed themselves just in time. The day after her visit to Mrs. Hargrave, Miss Marple received another visitor, this time unannounced. It was Clara, the servant from the Mortimer estate, standing at Miss Marple's garden gate, her cap askew and her fingers tugging nervously at her apron. The early morning sun was still low, casting long shadows across the cobbled path, and the dew-damp marigolds lining the fence. "I'm sorry," Miss Clara said, in a low voice. "I wouldn't bother you if I weren't so frightened." Miss Marple left with a reassuring nod. "Come in, my dear. The water has just boiled." Once inside, Clara perched on the edge of the kitchen chair, her eyes fixed as if expecting someone to burst in. Miss Marple poured tea and set out a small plate of shortbread, giving it time to settle. "It's about the day Lady Mortimer died," Clara began. "I remembered something I didn't think was important, but now I'm not so sure." Miss Marple folded her hands. "Start from the beginning, Clara. From the time you came downstairs that morning." Clara took a deep breath. "I was dusting the living room early in the morning, before breakfast. Lady Mortimer had gone out into the garden, and I was alone. That's when I noticed the letter had fallen to the floor, right next to the desk. The envelope was already torn apart, and I only read the first line before realizing that it was not intended for me." Miss Marple leaned slightly forward. "What was she saying?" Clara frowned, trying to remember. "She said, 'If you don't tell her, I will do it.' That's all I. Then I heard footsteps, and I put them on the desk. But Lady Mortimer had to see me later in the morning. She was in a bad mood, more than usual. She kept asking who had entered her office, and someone else from the living room in the living room that morning." Clara nodded. "Mr. Henry, I saw it through the corridor window. He was holding something by hand, a small velvet box. He put it in the buffet. I found it strange. But hey, he has always been secretive." "A velvet box?" Miss Marple asked. "Yes, mademoiselle, like a jewelry box." Miss Marple's eyes fold slightly, but her tone remains light. "And have you seen the box?" Clara shook her head. "No, mademoiselle, I had forgotten it so far." Miss Marple thinks in silence. A hidden letter, a mysterious box, and a confrontation that no one had witnessed. It became more and more obvious that Lady Mortimer held more secrets than we had suspected. Later in the day, Miss Marple takes a walk, not by chance, in front of the estate. She was not surprised to find the grids open and the park unusually calm. Morning had this strange way to create loneliness, Even in the most lively houses, she was greeted by Miss Langley, the housekeeper, who spoke to her with a sweatless but respectful head, and the lace shadow. "Miss Marple?" she asked, with an air heart. Miss Marple smiles. "Not this time. I hope she found a suitable place." Miss Langley sniffed. She put it back on the shelf of the salon of Mrs. Hargrave. "Where she must be, I am sure. She made a number of them." "What about Lady Mortimer's personal affairs? Were they stored?" "Not yet. A lawyer is coming next week. In the meantime, the library and the office are locked, but the living room was cleaned. Some objects are moved. But that's normal." Miss Marple hosted his head politely, but her mind was already thinking about the implication. A box placed in a drinking piece of furniture by Henry, a torn and threatening letter, and a cup of tea that has remained intact. She continued her walk in the village, stopping at the presbytery, where the Reverend Lembridge welcomed her with his usual benevolent smile, and offered her tea. Joyce had come out to visit a friend, but the Reverend seemed delighted with his company.
She always had an imposing presence, just like Eugenia, he said, thoughtfully. There was something in his imperious character, but not devoid of heart. Miss Marple seemed thoughtful. "Did she often confide in you?" "From time to time," says the Reverend by serving tea, "but never on his family. It was a sacred place." She fiercely protected her nephew, even when the village chatted, especially when the gossip focused on his financial failures. Miss Marple zeroed her tea. "And did she never talk about Mrs. Hargrave?" The Reverend laughs. "Oh, several times. Generally with measured words. They were rivals. In a sense, old fortune against older pride. She had never mentioned that something had been stolen from her. She complained once," said the Reverend, becoming serious. "Last month, said something precious had disappeared from his office, but when I asked her what it was, she beckoned him." Miss Marple finished her tea and got up. "Thank you, Reverend. You have been the most useful." As she went out on the track again, she stopped. Something precious lacks in the office. The letter, the box, all the small pieces that have not yet been framed, but everyone was talking about a pattern, and none suggested an accident. That evening, just when the light began to fade behind the hills, Miss Marple made a deliberate decision. She called Miss Elspeth Norton, who praised her with a theatrical surprise. "Well, well, Miss Marple, come and compare theories. Just tea, if not too many problems," Miss Marple said slightly. Inside, Miss Norton poured out with fulfillment. "The village is in excitement. You know, half of the parish thinks that Henry did. The other half suspects Clara, and there is a small vocal faction that believes that Mrs. Hargrave poisoned the cup of tea." "Oh?" Miss Marple raised an eyebrow. "Not me, of course," Miss Norton said quickly. "I have my eye on my nephew. It is of the classic type, overwhelmed by secrets, desperately needs funds. You can practically write the book yourself." "Indeed," Miss Marple said gently. "But life, I find, does not always follow the narrative form." Miss Norton leaned forward. "So what do you think?" Miss Marple did not respond. She just smiled, took a sip of her tea, and looked out the window towards the calm street beyond. That night, back in her own living room, she started her notebook again. She turned to a new page and wrote a threatening letter. Maybe the blackmail of the velvet box hidden by Henry, the content of the unknown teacup. Why, Lady Mortimer's fear was real, and growing. Then she wrote, stressed that the killer planned the public drama, but the method required confidentiality. A poisoned cup, tea changed, or scare, carefully orchestrated. Miss Marple put her pen and tackled her hands. There was still a place where she needed to look, not in the hearts of the villagers this time, but in the shadow of the fair itself. For somewhere in that room, she believed, the real clue had been hidden all along, not in what had been added to the scene, but in what had been carefully, deliberately removed. It was a grey, damp morning in Chipping Woodley when Miss Marple once more visited the Mortimer estate. A light drizzle misted the hedges and clung to her gloves. But that didn't bother her. Rain, she had always believed, had a curious way of softening tempers and dispelling pretense. One was often more sincere on gloomy days. Miss Langley, the housekeeper, opened the door with her usual air of polite suspicion. "If you have any further questions, Miss Marple, please be brief." The solicitor is coming this afternoon. Miss Marple gave her her usual disarming smile. No questions today, Mrs. Langley. Just one request. May I see the drawing room one last time? Mrs. Langley frowned, but the old woman's reputation for harmless curiosity earned her a reluctant nod. 10 minutes, she said, leading the way. Nothing has been touched since the inspection ended, except for the carpet, the crumbs of which we had to whisk out after the party. Miss Marple walked into the drawing room and stood very still. It was an elegant space, with wide bay windows, a polished walnut sideboard, and 2 high-backed armchairs facing the fireplace. In one corner was the drinks cabinet, and beside it, the tea set still gleamed from a recent polish. Everything was in its place. Everything was spotless. But something was missing. Miss Marple turned her head slowly, her gaze scanning the wall. Her gaze fell on a small, empty brass hook by the bookcase. It was holding something, wasn't it? She asked. Mrs. Langley followed her gaze. Oh yes, a framed miniature, a portrait of Lady Mortimer's mother, quite old. It fell the day after all this. Miss Marple squinted. Fell? Who took it? Me, said a voice from the doorway. They both turned. Henry Mortimer was standing there, wet with rain, holding a folded newspaper. I asked Mrs. Langley to take it down, he said, coming into the room. My aunt hated it. She said it reminded her of her childhood, which was unpleasant. I thought she wouldn't want it lying in state at her funeral. Miss Marple was silent for a moment. Then, softly, where is it now? Henry hesitated. Tidy, I think, in an attic trunk. She nodded, as if that explained everything, but her gaze lingered on him longer than politeness required. Thank you, she said. It's useful to understand these little details. As she turned to leave, Henry spoke again. Miss Marple, do you believe she was murdered? It was a simple question, asked in a low voice, and Miss Marple answered just as simply. I believe someone feared her enough to silence her. Whether through malice or manipulation, I cannot yet say. Henry said nothing, but the muscles in his jaw tightened. Miss Marple went back to her cottage and made herself a pot of tea. She sat by the fire, knitting on her knee, in deep thought. An empty crochet hook, a miniature disappeared, and Clara's mention of a velvet box, such insignificant little things perhaps, if you consider them together. It was nearly noon when she received a visit from a rather unexpected person. Colonel Draycott, in an oilskin overcoat and immaculately brushed boots, appeared at her door looking profoundly uncomfortable. Miss Marple, he said, with the air of a man about to confess to borrowing a neighbor's rake, I wonder if I could force a brief conversation with you. Of course, Colonel, Miss Marple said kindly. Come in, out of the rain. Inside he stood awkwardly until she pointed to the armchair by the fire. I came, he said, clearing his throat, because I think I've made a serious error of judgment. Not recent. Miss Marple remained silent, pouring tea. You see, many years ago, I knew Peter, Lady Mortimer's younger brother, a bit of a scoundrel, to tell the truth. He'd gotten into debt, kept company with unsavory women, gotten himself into trouble. He'd disappeared after some business in London, and the family had never heard of him again. Rumor had it he had died abroad. Miss Marple inclined her head. And yet, you think not? I saw a photograph, said Draycott, reaching into his coat. Last week was a celebration. A man in a newspaper article about a charity fraud in Kent. A perfect match for Peter. Same eyes, same slope of the chin. I cut out the photograph. I meant to ask Lady Mortimer discreetly, but she died. Miss Marple took the clipping. The face in the photograph was indeed striking, belligerent, intense, unmistakably linked to the Mortimer line. Do you think he has returned? Draycott nodded. If so, and Lady Mortimer knew it, perhaps that letter she had received threatened to reveal the family secret. Miss Marple's fingers rested lightly on the newspaper. How curious, she murmured, that, after all these years, something long buried is coming to the surface. Draycott stood up. I've said more than I should have, no doubt, but I thought you should know. Miss Marple thanked him with a warm smile, but inwardly, her mind was spinning. Secrets, it seemed, had been discussed long before the parasol reappeared, or the teacup was left untouched. That afternoon, she went quietly down to the Red Hart Inn. It was almost empty, except for Miss Elspeth Norton, sitting by the fireplace with a notebook,
and a half-finished sherry. "Elspeth," said Miss Marple, joining her without waiting for an invitation, "you are a woman who appreciates intrigue. Tell me, how would you conceive of a murder that no one is supposed to suspect?" Miss Norton raised an eyebrow. "Interesting question. It would require a diversion, something catchy. Of course, like a dramatic collapse in the middle of a party, a touch theatrical, and the method subtle. No blood or knives. Too raw. Poison, perhaps. Or a scare. A carefully timed scare." Miss Marple nodded. "What if the victim suspected the killer?" Miss Norton sipped her sherry. "Then the killer must strike before being named. That's always the problem with secrets. Once whispered, they start to scream." Outside, the rain was clearing. The clouds parted enough for a dull light to fall on the cobblestones. Miss Marple stood and thanked her companion. On her way back to her cottage, she passed Mrs. Hargrave's house. The curtains were drawn, but a blurred figure appeared inside. Miss Marple didn't stop, but she noticed the tension in the silhouette at the window, the stiffness of someone afraid of a knock too soon. In her living room, she jotted one last note in her notebook, before dinner, about the internal threat to the family. The method isn't obvious. Emotional, psychological, the clue isn't what was added, but what was taken away. And underneath, she underlined someone wanted to erase the past, but they forgot. Miss Marple remembers everything, especially what no one else remembers. The rain stopped completely in the morning, and the village of Chipping Woodley awoke to a pale, faded sun. Dew clung to every petal and every pane of glass, making the hedges sparkle. It was a cool morning, calm and serene, deceptively so. A morning that foreshadowed no scandal. Miss Marple, as usual, had risen early. She ate breakfast leisurely, buttering a plain slice of toast, and once more glanced over her little handwritten notes. A pattern was beginning to emerge, not neat, but like a tapestry whose pattern was finally emerging from its tangled threads. She was wondering whether to return to the Mortimer estate, when a sharp knock at the door pulled her from her thought. It was Joyce Lembridge, flustered and breathless, whose pale face spoke volumes even before she said a word. "Miss Marple, halt Estelle, you must come. They've found something. At the estate, in the attic." Miss Marple didn't ask questions. She simply took her cardigan and hat and followed the girl into the cool morning air. The Mortimer estate loomed into view, grander, quieter, and more mysterious by the day. Mrs. Langley met them at the door, her face fixed. "In the attic," she said. "We were packing boxes for the solicitor when Clara opened one of the old trunks." She screamed. Miss Marple climbed the stairs slowly, one step at a time, to the dusty top floor. The air was thick with the smell of mothballs and shoe polish. The attic was vast, with slightly sagging beams and trunks stacked like forgotten graves. A trunk stood open in the center of the room. Inside, on top of yellowed lace and an old silk shawl, was a small velvet box, the very one Clara had spoken of. Miss Marple bent down and lifted it delicately. The velvet was faded, the brass clasp slightly tarnished. She opened it. Inside was a brooch. Not just any branch. This was Lady Mortimer's, no doubt. A striking oval of garnets and seed pearls, set in a gold filigree frame, a family heirloom. But that wasn't what took Miss Marple's breath away. Pinned beside it, almost hidden in the silk lining, was a note, in neat, slanted handwriting. It read, "I know what you've done. If you don't tell the truth, I will." No name, no date, just the threat, and the presence of the brooch Lady Mortimer had worn on the day she died. Or had she? Miss Marple turned to Mrs. Langley. "Didn't Lady Mortimer wear her brooch to the garden party?" Mrs. Langley looked puzzled. "Yes, she always wore it, every year." Joyce frowned. "But if it's here, then she's not wearing it." Miss Marple gently closed the box. "Someone wanted us to believe that she was." They went back downstairs in silence, each lost in her own thoughts. Miss Marple stood in the corridor for a moment, and then turned slowly to Clara, who had remained near the bottom of the attic steps, wringing her hands. "You didn't scream because you found the box, did you?" Miss Marple said kindly. Clara's eyes filled with tears. "No, miss, I screamed because I recognized her. I saw that bun the morning of the party on the drinks cabinet in the drawing room. I meant to take it back to her dressing table, but when I came back it was gone." "And did you tell anyone?" "No, miss, I was scared. It's a valuable piece. I thought someone would say I'd taken it." Miss Marple gave her a slight nod. "Thank you, Clara. That's very useful." She steps out into the fresh air, thoughts racing. The brooch had been removed, not by accident. It had been placed, or perhaps hidden, but whatever the case, it had disappeared before Lady Mortimer's death, which meant someone wanted to create an illusion of normality, of continuity. But why? That afternoon, the solicitor, Mr. Dillard, arrived from Exeter and entered the office, his arms laden with files and a face ready to discreetly surprise. A small crowd had gathered. Henry Mortimer, Hargrave, pale and thin-lipped, her hands clasped like a stone sculpture, and Miss Norton, invited by no one, but always present when a tragedy was about to erupt. "I have examined the contents of Lady Mortimer's will," announced Mr. Dillard. "As one might expect, the bulk of the estate goes to her nephew, Mr. Henry Mortimer." Henry said nothing, contenting himself with a curt nod. However, Mr. Dillard continued, adjusting his glasses. A revision had been made 2 weeks before her death. All eyes turned to him then. "A codicil," he said, brandishing a parchment, unwitnessed but signed. She intended to create a trust for a child, that of her brother Peter, illegitimate, but acknowledged. The room fell silent. Miss Norton gasped. "Peter Mortimer, I thought he was dead." "Like most people," said Dillard, "but the codicil refers to a recent photograph. She thought he was alive, and she thought he had a daughter." Henry's voice was brittle. "It's impossible." Mrs. Hargrave, on the other hand, appeared perfectly still. Her knuckles whitened around her handbag. Miss Marple, watching silently from a chair by the window, folded her hands. "If this child exists," said Dillard, "Lady Mortimer intended to award her half of the estate." A long silence followed. Henry stood frozen. So someone had a lot to lose if this document was validated. "Yes," said Dillard, "or a lot to gain if it disappeared." Miss Marple rose slowly. The codicil was kept in her writing desk. Mr. Dillard, "Yes," he replied, "in the bottom drawer among her personal effects." Miss Marple smiled, and if I remember correctly, Miss Hargrave was pacing back and forth in this room on the morning of the garden party. Mrs. Hargrave stood up abruptly. "Are you accusing me of something, Miss Marple?" "Not at all," Miss Marple said softly, "simply observing that those with the most to lose are often the quickest to react when change threatens their comfort." Miss Norton quickly scribbled something in her notebook. "This is becoming a novel I wish I had written." Henry looked dazed. She had never mentioned it to me, or Peter, or a child. "Perhaps she had meant to," Miss Marple said softly, "but someone had made sure she never had the chance." Outside the study, the corridor filled with whispers and questions. Inside, Miss Marple sat back, her gaze lost. A hidden brooch, a vanished heir.
A child lost to gossip and time. She suddenly remembered the portrait that had once hung on the parlour wall, that of Lady Mortimer's mother, unhooked, deliberately removed. But why? Unless the child resembled the grandmother, enough so that, if anyone saw the resemblance in a guest, a villager, a servant, they would guess the connection. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed slightly. The truth was close now, but she would need one last gesture to reveal it. A nudge, a moment, and she knew who to ask. Evening fell over Chipping Woodley in the slow silence of a curtain being drawn. The church bell rang softly in the distance, and the air took on that particular country freshness that revealed the dew settling on the stone walls and the lavender hedges. The lamps lit one by one in the cottage windows, and behind them, murmured conversations around the dinner tables, speculations, suspicions, theories. Lady Mortimer is dead. Her will revealed more than her life ever had. A secret child, a hidden codicil, a missing brooch, and somewhere in that tangle of lace and lies, a killer who had managed for nearly a week to move unseen, but not unnoticed. Miss Marple, sitting at her modest table, had spent most of the day weaving the last threads of the pattern. Now, with deliberate caution, she poured herself a modest sherry and reviewed the plan for the evening. She had addressed the invitations precisely, not with a formal note, of course. That would have aroused gossip and hesitation. Each had received a personal note, simply an informal mention, that Miss Marple would be holding a discreet gathering that evening to discuss Lady Mortimer's death. It was the kind of language that softened defenses and disarmed suspicion. Shortly after 8 p.m., they began to arrive. Mrs. Hargrave, as always, was first, dressed in dove grey, her chin raised as if awaiting a lecture, and daring her to begin. She took her seat in the drawing room, with a sigh and a murmur about the weather. Next came Henry Mortimer, looking thinner than ever, his eyes dark with circles, his clothes hung off him, expensive but unsure. He nodded quickly to the others, then sank into the armchair nearest the fireplace. Miss Elspeth Norton followed, uninvited but entirely expected. She brought her notebook, a wry smile, and a watchful eye. She stood by the tea tray, already anticipating revelations. Then came Clara, led by Joyce, the vicar's daughter, who encouraged her to attend. Clara was pale and tense, her hers clutching the strap of her handbag. The room was silent for a moment. Miss Marple stood by the window, watching them with the same gentle gaze that had observed so many church fetes, parish meetings and harvest fairs over the years. "I brought you here," she began in a soft but clear voice, "because I believe we all deserve clarity, not only about what had happened to poor Lady Mortimer, but also about why it had happened, and how it had almost remained hidden." No one spoke. Mrs. Hargrave's lips trailed off. Miss Marple turned to the sideboard, and took up the velvet box they had found in the attic. "This brooch," she said, opening it carefully, "must have been worn by Lady Mortimer at the garden party. Clara, you said you found it on the drinks cabinet that morning." Clara nodded weakly. "Yes, miss. But Lady Mortimer wasn't wearing it when she died." Miss Marple continued, "Because it had already been taken, then placed in that box and hidden in the attic trunk. Why hide it, unless it proved something no one wanted to see?" Miss Norton's quill scratched furiously. "I propose," Miss Marple said quietly, "that someone removed the brooch to make it appear as if Lady Mortimer was wearing it, so that when she died, everything would appear normal. But they forgot one detail. The miniature portrait had also been removed from the parlor wall. This too was deliberate, for the resemblance would have revealed a family resemblance. A dangerous resemblance." Joyce blinked. "Resemblance to whom?" Miss Marple turned to Clara, whose eyes widened. "I believe," Miss Marple said calmly, "that Clara is the child Lady Mortimer spoke of in her codicil. Peter Mortimer's daughter." A gasp escaped from somewhere near the other. Clara began to shake her head, but tears were welling up in the corners of her eyes. "No, it can't be like that." Miss Marple came over and knelt beside her. "Your mother worked as a lady's companion, didn't she, in her younger days, in London? She died when you were just a child, and you were very young. Lady Mortimer didn't hire you by chance. She brought you here to observe you, perhaps even to protect you, and in time, she must have confirmed what she feared, or hoped." Clara was trembling now, gripping the arms of the chair. "I didn't know," she whispered. "Not until I found this letter on her desk. It contained a photograph. It spoke of a child. I didn't mean to." "You haven't done anything wrong, my dear," Miss Marple said softly, "but someone else has." She turned to the others. Someone who had seen this very letter. Someone who understood that if Lady Mortimer changed her will, everything would change. This person knew about the codicil, and about Clara. Mrs. Hargrave stood up. "This is pure fantasy. Clara, a Mortimer." Miss Marple didn't flinch. "You hated Henry. You wished you had inherited anything. But what really frightened you was Clara. You had seen the resemblance in that portrait. You had heard Lady Mortimer speak kindly of her. And you feared being supplanted. You had a motive." Mrs. Hargrave's voice deepened. "You have no proof. The doctor said it was her heart." "Her heart was weak," Miss Marple agreed. "But what tipped her over the edge was fear. You knew she always had tea at the same time. You didn't need poison. You just had to stage the moment. The stolen parasol, returned in public, was your distraction. And the letter, gone. The brooch, removed, so that it appeared unchanged. But fear, well placed, can do as much as any poison. You told her that, didn't you? You told her you'd denounce Clara. You told her you'd burn everything she had planned." Mrs. Hargrave remained motionless. "And you think fear alone is murder?" Miss Marple looked her straight in the eye. "Yes, when it's deliberate, and when it's cruel." Henry finally spoke. "Is that true, about Clara?" Miss Marple gave him a firm nod. "Yes, and your aunt intended to put things right." Henry turned to Clara, his face unreadable, then inclined his head slowly. Miss Norton put down her notebook. "Well," she said, "that's the ending I didn't see coming." Miss Marple turned back to the window, silence reigning behind her. Outside, the street had grown silent again.
the silence that follows the truth, when it finally takes its rightful place. In time there would be declarations, visits from the authorities, and the writing of a new will, but for now there was only the crackle of the fire, and the faint rustle of relief. The trap was set, the play had been performed, and Miss Marple, ever gentle, had pulled the last string. The next morning, soft and rosy, dawned over Chipping Woodley, as if the village itself were breathing after a week of pent-up tension. The church bells rang for the 8 o'clock mass. The hens clucked nonchalantly in their coops, and the smell of toast drifted from the open window. Ostensibly it was a return to normal, but behind the lace curtains and manicured hedges, the village was wide awake to the whispers. At the center of it all was Miss Marple. She had remained gracious and serene after her meeting the day before, declining questions, dodging compliments, and sidestepping gratitude with a nod and a whisper. It was nothing, really, just an observation. Yet everyone knew that something had changed, and that change brought with it the final revelation of the mystery that hovered, silent and festering, beneath the genteel surface of village life. Later that morning, Inspector Walsh arrived from the regional office, summoned by Sergeant Davis, who had written a careful and particularly impassioned report after Miss Marple's revelations. He was a pragmatic man, Walsh, who did not appreciate village theatrics or whispered accusation, but he respected Miss Marple's wit, and he respected the silence she cultivated when others rushed to explain themselves. She found him outside his cottage, gloved and poised. "I think I can be of use to you," she said, "if you would come with me." They walked leisurely through the village, past the post office, the greengrocer, and the vicarage, until they reached the Mortimer estate. There in the shadow of the stone arch, Miss Marple paused. "You will find the brooch in the trunk in the attic," she said, "and the letter is no longer in Lady Mortimer's study. It was burned, but not before it was seen." Inspector Walsh looked at her steadily. "Seen by you?" "No," she replied. "Seen by Clara, the maid, who after all is Peter Mortimer's daughter. What makes her Lady Mortimer's niece?" He blinked, but didn't interrupt her. "Clara didn't know," Miss Marple continued. "Not until the last day. Lady Mortimer had planned to tell her, to rewrite her will. She'd left a codicil, of course, but she hadn't spoken the truth aloud yet, and this silence gives someone else the opportunity to act." "Mrs. Hargrave," Walsh said quietly. Miss Marple nodded. "Indeed, a woman used to power, to inheritance, to being the most admired person in the world. She saw Clara as a threat, and Lady Mortimer's growing affection for her only made things worse." They reached the gravel drive to the back of the house, where the garden sloped gently down to the orchard. The hydrangeas drooped slightly in the early morning sun. "She didn't poison Lady Mortimer," Miss Marple said. "That was important. She didn't need to. The old lady's heart was already fragile, but Mrs. Hargrave had chosen the precise moment to push her. Verbally, emotionally, she had threatened bluntly to reveal Clara's identity before Lady Mortimer could protect her, to reveal the scandal to the village. She had used the parasol as a diversion, Walsh had said. Half to himself. "Exactly," Miss Marple had replied. "She had placed it among the raffle items. Clara is accused of stealing it. What better way to divert attention than to stage a little village riddle at the same time as the murder?" Walsh pursed his lips. A fake crime to hide a real one. She had timed her confrontation so well, Miss Marple continued. Just before tea, the doctor had concluded it was a heart attack, because that was exactly what it was. But she had been provoked, manipulated. Mrs. Hargrave was the last person to speak to Lady Mortimer. Clara saw her leave the drawing room, overcome with emotion, without grasping its significance at the time. The inspector was silent for a moment, and the brooch, taken from Lady Mortimer's hands earlier that morning. Clara had found it on the drinks cabinet. Someone, Miss Hargrave, had placed it there, probably with the intention of retrieving it later. But Clara came home early, and the plan had to change. The brooch was eventually hidden in the attic chest. Another false lid. They continued on, heading for the orchard. A light breeze stirred the leaves, and a robin chirped somewhere above them. "She was afraid of the girl," Miss Marple said softly. "She feared she would change everything Lady Mortimer had built. But more than that, she feared she was useless, overwhelm, and fear, Inspector, is a powerful motivator, especially in those who are already proud. When they returned to the house, Mrs. Hargrave was sitting in the conservatory, a shawl elegantly draped over her shoulders. She stood up when she saw them, her expression impassive. "Inspector Walsh," she said softly. "I suppose this is an official visit." "It is," he replied. "I'd like to ask you a few questions." She sat back down with perfect composure. "Very well. Though I dare say we both know what this is about." Miss Marple remained by the door, her voice soft. "You could have said nothing. You could have let Clara remain who she believed herself to be." Mrs. Hargrave turned her gaze toward the garden. "And let that girl inherit everything. Let the Mortimer name be dragged into scandal again. No. Eugenia was blinded by sentiment. But I saw through it." "She was your friend," Miss Marple said softly. Mrs. Hargrave's jaw tightened. "She was an idiot. And I did what she refused to do. I protected what little dignity she had left." Inspector Walsh stepped forward. "You understand that what you have done, however subtle, has resulted in a death." For the first time, Mrs. Hargrave's face trembled. She was already weak. "I simply reminded her of what she stood to lose. And that," Walsh said, "was enough." She made no further protest. Later that afternoon, she was quietly led from the estate. There was no show, no handcuffs, no shouting, only silence. Miss Marple watched from the edge of the garden path, her expression unreadable. In the following days, Clara was formally recognized as Lady Mortimer's niece. Henry, to his credit, welcomed her into the family with a dignity that surprised many. The codicil stands, the inheritance shared. Miss Norton wrote nothing, at least not yet. Yet her eyes glittered every time she passed the estate, and one suspected that a novel was already forming in her mind. And Chipping Woodley, as always, resumes its rituals. The Women's Guild meets again under a new direction. The lace shadow was removed, perhaps forever, and at the presbytery, tea resumed with a little more gossip than before. As for Miss Marple, she spent her afternoon in the garden, cutting her roses, and conversing with the red gorges. Thanks and congratulated. She just smiled and said it was nothing. We tell you what you need to know if you listen carefully, because in the end, she knew that the truth did not live in the cup of tea, neither in the umbrella, nor even in the spin. It resided in the quietest place, the human heart. Summer in Chipping Woodley was dragging, softened by time and the resilience of the village routine. The incident, as it had been called, always in a low voice, and accompanied by a quick glance over the shoulder, dissolved slowly in the memory. As with everything in the English villages, even death was absorbed by daily life, stored like the linen of the day before, and replaced by the comforting rhythm of the present. The Domaine des Mortimer had changed, not externally, because the gravel driveway was still swept every morning, and the hedges always cut with military precision, but inside something was softened. The house no longer had the rigidity of the judgment or the weight of past grandeur. Henry Mortimer, although always calm and reserved, now walked with more determination. He started to manage the accounts of the domain directly, and the villagers noticed his increased presence within the community, at the church, at the market, and even to the rare meetings of the Women's Guild, where he was always a little awkward, but never rude. Clara, dear Clara, uncertain, had asserted herself with quiet dignity. His shoulders were firmer, his voice more assured than before. With Lady Mortimer's latest wishes being respected, and her position within the legitimized family, she had chosen not to leave her post at the domain, despite Henry's proposal to install him in Exeter or Bath.
Rather, she had asked for something modest but significant. The small cottage at the edge of the orchard, formerly used for guests and garden staff. She filled him with flowers, books and memories that she was barely starting to understand. Miss Marple had visited him one afternoon, carrying a pot of red geraniums. "I thought you would like a little color near the windows," said by gently placing the pot on the table. Clara smiles. "It's charming, Miss Marple. Thank you. I still have the impression of being in someone else's life." "Ah," said Miss Marple, settling in the chair near the fireplace. "But that's how all lives begin, Clara, borrowed, shaped by others. This is what we do with it, once we are aware of it, which truly makes them ours." Clara looked down to her hands. I still don't know if she had planned to tell me. I think Miss Marple gently says that she was afraid. No, you. But the way the world would treat you if he knew. She had spent her life protecting the name of Mortimer. But perhaps, in her last weeks, she understood that certain truths are better than appearances. Clara nodded, her eyes fogged. They remained sitting for a moment in an accomplice's silence, only troubled by the distant song of birds in the orchard. It was no longer the silence of the secret, but that of peace. Back in the village, history had become folk in its own way. Children whispered lace parasols with haunted eyes, imagining ghosts and curses. The older villagers remembered this differently, as a story of warning of ambition, pride, and the hidden cost of appearance maintenance. Miss Elspeth Norton, not surprisingly, started working on a new manuscript. Although she never directly appointed Chipping Woodley, all those who read the first pages when they were finally released in the spring recognized her immediately. Everything was the village party, tea murder, parasol, and portrait. Only the names had changed, and the last chapter brought a dedication to the silent minds that see what others ignore. At the Red Hart Inn, customers have again turned their attention to livestock, precipitation and the comparative strength of lemon curd recipes. Sergeant Davis, who had received an elegant mention in the form of a severe handshake from the chief inspector, returned to the management of bicycle flights and missing pigs, with quiet satisfaction. However, each time he exceeded Miss Marple in the way, he changed his cap with a little additional respect. One Sunday morning, a few weeks after Mrs. Hargrave was escorted from the estate, the vicar said a sermon which lingered on grace, the value of humility and the dangers of secret. There was no direct mention of recent events, of course. It would have been improper, but several parishioners watched Miss Marple during the sermon, their thoughtful expressions, and she, for her part, sat down because she always had neat eyes, attentive to the manual, her hands folded on her lap. This afternoon, when the sun extended to golden fingers through the green village, Miss Marple was sitting in her garden, pruning down her roses. The flowers were particularly busy this year, full and fragrant, and it took silent pleasure in their constancy. The world has changed. People come and go, but roses are still flourishing. Joyce Cambridge stopped with her bike, calling the door. "I'm going to Exeter to visit my cousin," she said strongly. "But I just wanted to say, Miss Marple, you were incredible. The way you have resolved all of this." Miss Marple smiled and withdrew her gloves. "Oh, my dear. I have resolved everything. I just watched and listened to it. People show you what they are, if you are calm enough to leave them." Joyce leaned over the handlebars. "However, it was extraordinary. I don't think I will see a parasol in the same way." "You shouldn't either," said Miss Marple, laughing. "These are the little things that matter the most. Neglected, apparently decorative. They reveal the character much better than the great gestures could never." Joyce smiled, then greeted and led in the way, the dust rising behind her. Miss Marple was held for a moment, looking at the campaign to settle in her lull at the end of the afternoon. The breeze rushed the leaves of its apple tree. Somewhere, a kettle whistled. A dog barked in the distance, and life, as it has always done, has advanced. She entered inside, suspended her gloves, through the door, and sat with a tea jar and the thin volume of poetry that she intended to see again. Outside, the light has turned amber, painting the world with a gentle warmth that softens each edge. And although the village would always carry the shadow of what had happened, although the parasol of lace hung in memory, a delicate and deadly peace, in a kind, had returned. Miss Marple turned the page, sipped her tea and smiled. Justice had been done. The truth had found its way through the hedges, and no one, not even the smartest murderer, could go beyond a spirit formed to the subtleties of human nature. The roses continued to flower, and Miss Marple, still composed, never watching, turned her thoughts towards the festival of the next village, and wondered with just a touch of fun what peculiarities could flourish there.